All right then, evening students, how's it going? Today we are going to be talking about several topics, most of which are going to be on your exam. Now, the noted Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm coined the term the long 19th century to describe the period of time from the beginning of the outbreak of the French Revolution to the outbreak of World War One. And he reasoned that it was because the 19th century, as an actual century, was 100 years, but the 19th century as a sequence of political events was really something that started with the French Revolution. So we've covered the French Revolution already in some detail, and I feel our discussion now should shift to what happens after the Napoleonic era. So Napoleon was a remarkably talented statesman, but most importantly, he was a fairly talented military man. He was able to lead France to victory in an astounding number of military conflicts, and the resulting conflicts had upset the balance of power in Europe, with France taking on multitudes of nations at a time and winning broadly, up until eventually Napoleon's luck ran out. And at Waterloo, he met his final demise at the hands of the British and the Prussians. Prussians don't get enough credit for that. Even as Napoleon was marching towards his final defeat, the powers of Europe arrived in Vienna in September of 1814 to discuss what was going to be done about the balance of power in Europe. Now, here's the thing. Their objective wasn't just to sort of switch things back. They wanted to create a lasting peace plan. So they wanted to try and negotiate the boundaries of Europe in such a way that there would be a balance of power. On top of that, they wanted to negotiate it on the basis of what was known as legitimacy of power. So what that meant was that they believed there were certain rightful rulers of Europe. Let me just adjust that, yeah. And so those rightful rulers would be able to take power in each case. The engineer, the architect of the Congress of Vienna was a man named Klemens von Metternich. Klemens von Metternich is a man who is probably one of the most well-known champions of conservatism, and we'll talk about conservative orders in Europe in a little bit. Klemens von Metternich was so symbolic of the conservative movement that he's mentioned by name in the beginning of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. So the guy made it, he made the cut. What happened, of course, was Metternich decided that he could set the negotiations up, and he could probably secure good bargaining rights for Austria, which he managed to do. So the powers that had benefited the most from the Congress of Vienna, ultimately when the dust settled and they had finished the negotiations, which took the better part of a year and a half, were Prussia and Russia, different areas, and of course Austria. And they had managed to sort of get a lot of extra territories, and they managed to create a new map of Europe. I'm going to provide a link in the description below so you guys can go ahead and take a look at the link. Now, one of the more important political consequences of the Congress of Vienna was that the members of the Congress of Vienna were all conservatives. They didn't believe in the concept of republics. They believed that Europe should be ruled by kings and that the kings should have very little input from the people. They liked the system of absolute monarchy. They believed it was fine. So this was essentially a European map being drawn by people that didn't believe that the citizens, the people on the ground, should have any real input in Europe. So a lot of historians and scholars have criticized it for being ignorant to the concerns. But here's the thing. Aside from making sure that they would work together and that they would promote peace and that they wouldn't step on each other's toes, which was actually a remarkable feat. Now, despite the fact that the Congress of Vienna was a better deal for a lot of the bigger powers that had, more leverage, if you want, more leeway, what happened was it was a unique example, and it was one of the first modern examples of nations coming together on a large scale to negotiate and to work together. And the resulting period after the Congress of Vienna, it may not have been very fair for the people of Europe, but it was actually a very peaceful time for the people of Europe. So Austria would end up getting large sections of Italy. We're going to be talking about the unification of Italy later, so we come back to that, but that's not really on the test, so we're not going to negotiate it. Prussia would end up with a bunch of other German states. It would become even bigger, and it would take parts of Sweden. And Russia would gain parts of Poland. The Polish people obviously would keep getting the shaft. Napoleon had basically come up with a lot of his own crazy ideas for the division of Europe, so they were determined to just put paid to that and destroy any semblance of Napoleon's vision for Europe. Along with it, any concepts he had of modernizing Europe, of moving Europe towards a more, I don't know about democratic so much, but definitely a more modern state with a sort of codified legal system, his Napoleonic Code, any kind of attempt to create, a new system where people had civil rights, Napoleon was always a very confusing figure, I think, because he was a mixture of a dictator and a reformer. He wanted people to have civil rights and equality, but he wanted to be in charge. So I guess he wanted everybody to be equal except for him. He would be head honcho. So, the Congress of Vienna, main objectives. Number one, to ensure a balance of power in Europe. They wanted to draw the map in Europe to make sure, all right, everybody's happy with the piece of the pie they got. And there were all these little squabbles, and the smaller nations at some point had a problem, and then, they revisited it. One of the really unique things was that France ultimately, through some diplomatic maneuvering, was able to make sure that it had a seat at the table. And this is actually pretty remarkable. When we talk about World War I later, you can see the contrast, where the defeated power was no longer expected to be part of the negotiations. But this was actually important. So essentially, a lot of European powers would find themselves dominated by the kings that the Congress of Vienna had agreed on, which meant that the people, if they weren't happy with it, could just, go ahead and deal with it. There was no real recourse besides that. So the key terms that we need to focus on for the chapter are conservatism and liberalism. So once again, the signatories of the Congress of Vienna, and it's, by the way, why it's called a Congress, it wasn't like a formal set of meetings. A lot of their meetings were actually informal, face-to-face, just discussions, talking about it. If you look at a lot of the pictures and the portraits of it, it seems like they're just having themselves a get-together. They were conservatives. Now, the simplest way to understand that word conservative is to focus on the part conserve. To conserve something means to keep it the way it is. And the conservatives in 19th century Europe wanted to conserve Europe as it was. Focused on the monarchy, focused on Christianity, focused on stability, and they believed this was the best system. Liberals, on the other hand, as you guys may recall from our unit on the Enlightenment, believed that the people deserved to have civil rights, human rights. Now, the problem with liberalism was that there was very little faith in liberalism after the French Revolution. Once the fully liberal Jacobins had managed to take over and run the show, France turned into a bloodbath because they were so committed to liberty that they were willing to liberate people's heads from their shoulders. So obviously, France's experiment with democracy hadn't turned out so well. It was actually very understandable that a lot of people had diminished faith in democracy. I mean, even as far back, if you want to go even further with it, is the Roman Empire. People have had reason to believe that democracy causes more problems than it fixes. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So conservatives and liberals. And another movement that was popping up that had also come about in the wake of the French Revolution and Napoleon was nationalism. See, people, ethnic groups started to form the idea of their own distinct territories, nations. They started supporting this concept, and a lot of them were part of bigger empires. The Austrian Habsburg Empire was incredibly diverse. It had dozens of different ethnic groups in it, several languages spoken throughout the empire on a regular basis. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the national anthem was usually given in 3 different languages. So there were quite a few different ethnic groups living in the empire. And around the beginning of the 19th century, people started to get the idea in their heads. Now, not everyone, we'll try to go into more specifics there, that they wanted their own nations that represented their own culture, shared values, traditions, history. So, the Congress of Vienna wasn't having any of that. The Congress of Vienna was determined to make sure that the conservative order in Europe stayed the way it was. So the way that they had determined this was they also agreed that if revolutions ever broke out, they would collaborate to put the revolutions down. So this is actually a very big development because this is basically them committing themselves to the cause of conservatism with military force if necessary. And as you guys will see later on, military force was applied. Now, what happened was they managed for a good long period of time to, I would say, maintain stability in Europe. Now, at this stage as well, Europe was advancing. You had the development of new technologies, you had the development of the printing press, you had the development of new political ideas like liberalism, socialism, etc. So what happened essentially was people in various European countries, small groups at first, but then by 1848, they became much larger groups, started to push for their rights. Now, initially, the governments of, Britain, France, Russia, etc., were very impatient with these movements, and in a lot of cases, they violently put down revolts. They passed laws such as the Six Acts and the Carlsbad Decrees that forbade people to gather in public spaces, that forbade people to have weapons if they thought that they were going to use them against the people. So this mounted. Now, once again, the issue was that a lot of the revolutionary figures were middle class. But by 1848, the perceived failures of a lot of the governments in Europe and mounting economic crises as well as food shortages basically caused revolution to break out. So the revolutions of 1848 are a very famous example of a very unsuccessful series of revolutions. Almost all of them either ended in some manner of compromise, where the revolutionaries managed to sort of get through to the monarch, and the monarch agreed to set up a parliament, or set up a new constitution, or set up some kind of, basic reforms, or they ended up being violently repressed. In the case of France and Italy, violently repressed. In the case of Austria and Prussia and the German states, it was more that they got somewhere with it, but eventually they just lacked the follow through, and they didn't really manage to do anything about it. In France, what happened in the 1848 revolutions was that the king was becoming deeply unpopular. He was removed, and a provisional government, a temporary government, was introduced in his place. Now, this temporary government was made up of socialists and conservatives. The socialists in the temporary government started pushing for new work programs. Now, what they do is basically they'd set up workhouses where people could come and they could get jobs. And this was great because a lot of the poor people in Paris and in the bigger cities now had an option to, get some work, to make some money. Now, the problem with the conservatives was that this was being paid for with tax money. There was, tax money coming in, and the coffers were being spent on this. So eventually the provisional government turns into an actual government after they have elections, and the new government is predominantly conservative. Turns out people in France, because of the last time they had a revolution, were not willing to vote for liberals again. So they vote for these conservatives, these guys that want to keep things the way they are, these guys that want to keep things sort of the old-fashioned way. They don't want to move towards, socialism. We'll talk about socialism in more detail later. They win over. Things get out of hand. Protests turn into riots. Eventually, there's barricades set up. If you guys are familiar with the film / book / musical / I want to say app at this stage, Les Miserables, it's based on the 1848 revolutions in France. So the French Revolution is put down violently, and France ends up getting its law and order candidate, a new man. Louis Napoleon takes over, and he basically vows to be the conservative strongman. In Italy, there's also a push for the local pro-Austrian rulers to be removed. There's some success, but eventually Austria fights them in the north and defeats them after some very heavy fighting, and France interferes as well and puts down a number of the revolts. In Germany and Austria, they manage some success. The king agrees to some concessions, and there isn't really a Germany per se. There's the German states, but in Prussia, there's a revolution, and throughout the German states, there's a series of revolts, and this results in sort of assembly being set up and parliamentary reform is being carried out. Anyway, What happens is the 1848 revolutions all fail. Now, many people have pointed out that the reasons they failed, first of all, that there wasn't that much push behind them. The revolutions, the main revolutionaries seemed to be people that were from middle class backgrounds, seemed to be people who were educated, and these were the minority. A lot of the people in, the majority, they didn't really want much. They just wanted, a good livelihood. They didn't want that much political change. So they didn't push that hard. A lot of them just wanted to get back to their jobs and they wanted the revolutions to end. And on top of that, a bigger reason that the 1848 revolutions failed is because, simply put, the European powers were just too organized. They managed to crush the revolutions before they turned into serious movements. And this forced a lot of the revolutionary forces that wanted to push for unification in Italy and Germany to sort of re-examine their approach. And we'll talk about that once again in more detail. So this is the first segment, and it's focused on the Congress of Vienna, conservatism and liberalism, and the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions, as well as the reasons for the failure of the 1848 revolutions. I'm going to go ahead and upload another video talking about the Industrial Revolution and socialism. And so I guess we can go ahead and expect that one as long as it takes. I'll start uploading this one, though, right away. Anyway, hope it's been helpful. Thank you guys for watching.